1. The Mystery of the Erased Scriptures. In a quiet corner of an ancient library in Jerusalem, beneath the faint golden glow of an oil lamp that had burned for centuries, Dr. Annam stumbled upon something he never expected. A weathered leather-bound book, its cover frayed and worn, rested silently among stacks of yellowed papers. As he carefully turned its pages, handwritten lines emerged, not in the familiar Hebrew or Latin, but in Ge'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopia. What made his heart race wasn't the book's age, but its contents. Verses of the Bible never seen in any modern copy. Annam, a Vietnamese theologian living far from home, had spent his life chasing the truth behind forgotten texts. He'd always believed that the Bible, revered by billions, didn't tell the full story. Whispers from colleagues, fragmented historical records, and strange dreams had led him to this discovery. When he read the first line, "And the Lord said to the angels, hide the second light, so mankind may not see the kingdom of darkness," he knew he'd uncovered a mystery that could change everything. The idea of erased scriptures wasn't new to scholars. Since the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, church fathers had fiercely debated what to keep and what to discard. Some claimed these verses were removed for being too obscure or contradictory to doctrine. But Annam had a different theory. Perhaps they were hidden to conceal a greater truth, one humanity wasn't ready to face. The book before him seemed living proof, tales of Jesus descending to hell, unnamed angels guarding mankind, and forgotten prophecies of the end times. When he shared this with his closest friend, Lynn, a freelance journalist passionate about history, she was instantly hooked. "If this is real," she said, her eyes alight, "it'll change how we understand faith, God, even ourselves." But Annam wasn't quick to celebrate. He knew truth rarely came without a cost. History had shown that those who dared dig into forbidden knowledge often paid dearly. The impact of these deletions wasn't just academic. For Annam, it was a deeply spiritual question. If God's words had been altered, could the faith he and millions held for centuries truly stand firm? He recalled childhood prayers in a small Hanoi church, where his grandmother spoke of God's goodness. But if there were things even she didn't know, what did that say about the bond between humanity and the divine? That night, as moonlight streamed through his window, Annam set the book down and gazed at the starry sky. A strange feeling surged within him, excitement mixed with dread. This journey had just begun. The erased scriptures weren't mere words on a page, they were a key to a door sealed for millennia. And when that door opened, no one could predict what lay beyond. Chapter 2. The Value of Original Texts. The next morning, Annam and Lynn sat across from each other in a small cafe near the ancient library. Steam rose from 2 cups of black coffee, mingling with the scent of old books wafting from the leather tome Annam had brought. He placed it on the table, handling it as if it were a fragile treasure. "This isn't just a book," he said, his voice low but resolute. "It's a gateway back to where it all began." Lynn leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "What do you mean? Isn't the modern Bible enough to understand God?" Annam gave a faint smile, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "Enough? If you knew how much had been changed, cut, or lost in translation, you wouldn't ask that." He began to explain. The book he'd found was written in Ge'ez, the language of the Ethiopian Bible, one of the oldest surviving versions. Unlike the widely used Latin or Greek translations, the Ethiopian text preserved original writings that Western theologians had discarded. They called it simplification. Annam said, his tone tinged with irony, "I call it concealment." Lynn frowned. "Concealment? You mean someone deliberately hid the truth?" Annam nodded, flipping to a page of jagged script. "Look here, this passage says God spoke to the angels before creating man. Let them see the light, but keep them from touching the darkness." In modern versions, this doesn't exist. Why? Because it hints at another kingdom, a reality we're not meant to know. Lynn listened, trying to process it all. As a journalist used to uncovering facts, this was her first brush with a mystery beyond ordinary stories. So how important is it to study these original texts? She asked. And Nam sighed, gazing out at the bustling street. More than I can express. Modern translations aren't just linguistically flawed, they distort meaning. Take the story of God taking Adam's rib to create Eve. It's presented as a simple act, but in the Ethiopian original, it's not a rib, it's a part of his light. That changes everything about human origins, not just physical, but spiritual. Lynn blinked, startled. You mean we're losing not just stories, but their deeper truths? And Nam nodded. Exactly. Every translation is shaped by the beliefs, politics, and agendas of its time. Over centuries, those distortions pile up, pulling us further from the original truth. He spoke of late nights in Hanoi University's library, poring over medieval copies. Even the best scholars couldn't avoid adding or omitting. Sometimes unintentionally, sometimes not. I used to think faith was unshakable, he said, his voice softening. But seeing what's been taken away, I wonder, what are we really believing in? Lynn picked up the book, running her fingers over its rough cover. So what now? She asked. And Nam met her gaze, his resolve clear. I'll translate it, all of it, not just to understand, but to let the world know. But I'll need your help. This isn't a one-man job. Lynn grinned, a mix of curiosity and excitement. All right, but you know, if we publish this, some people won't be happy. And Nam nodded, as if he'd long anticipated it. I know, truth isn't always welcome, but if we don't seek it now, who will? As they left the cafe, the book safely tucked in a Nam's satchel, the Jerusalem sky turned gray with clouds, as if nature itself awaited something. And Nam didn't say it aloud, but he felt it. This wasn't just about uncovering the past, it was about facing what was coming. Mysteries deeper than the words in his hands. Chapter 3. Jesus descends to hell. Rain began to fall as Nam and Lynn entered his small hotel room in Jerusalem. The cramped space smelled of old books and damp wood, but it was here Nam felt safest to continue his work. On a scarred wooden table, the Ethiopian book lay open to a page he'd marked the night before. Its Ge'ez script told a story he'd never heard in any church, Jesus' descent into hell. Lynn sat across from him, cradling a steaming cup of tea she'd just brewed. All right, tell me, she urged. Jesus went to hell? I thought that was just a minor detail in the creed. He went down, came back up. End of story. And Nam shook his head, his eyes fixed on the page. Not that simple. In this original, it's not a brief visit. He spent 3 days there, facing the darkness, learning things humanity was never told. He read aloud, his voice resonant as it once was lecturing students in Hanoi. And while his body lay in the stone tomb, his soul descended to the kingdom of death. There, he saw rusted iron gates, rivers of fire, and souls bound in chains of despair. But he came not to judge, he came to understand. And Nam paused, looking at Lynn. Understand? She asked, skeptical. Understand what? And Nam took a deep breath. The darkness, the suffering, what humans face when they stray from God's light. In modern versions, we're told he went to free the righteous souls, Abraham, Moses. But here, it's different. He didn't just save them. He stood among demons, heard the cries of the damned, and faced Satan himself. Lynn shivered, though the room wasn't cold. That's creepy. You mean he talked to the devil? And Nam nodded. Yes, it says, and the ruler of darkness asked him, have you come to destroy me? But the Lord replied, I have come to see your truth. So the light is not blind to the dark. He didn't fight with swords or fire like in medieval paintings. He triumphed through understanding. Lynn frowned, trying to grasp it. But why? Why would he need to do that? He's God, he doesn't need to learn anything from hell. And Nam smiled sadly. That's what I wondered all night. Then I thought, maybe he did it for us. If he didn't understand the darkness, how could he guide humanity through it? This wasn't for his perfection, he was already perfect. It was to show us that even in the darkest place, there's hope. He turned the page, revealing a crude drawing, a figure amid flames, arms outstretched, surrounded by shadowy forms. Here, and Nam pointed, is how the ancient Ethiopians depicted it. He wasn't afraid, didn't tremble. He stood there, a lighthouse in a storm. Lin fell silent, then asked, "Why was this removed? If it's so important, why don't we know it?" And Nam sighed, resting his hand on the book. "I think they were afraid. The early compilers didn't want people thinking God could be so close to darkness. They wanted him as pure light, untarnished. But the truth is, he's not just light, he's the bridge between light and dark." That was too complex, too frightening to accept. The rain grew heavier, tapping the window in a steady rhythm. And Nam looked out, his mind drifting to childhood days under a Hanoi church roof, hearing his grandmother's tales of mercy. If she knew this, he whispered, what would she say? Lynn set her tea down, her tone serious. "Will you publish it? If you're right, this isn't just scholarship, it could change how people see Jesus. Their faith." And Nam nodded slowly. "I have to, not for controversy, but to restore the truth. But I know, Lynn, once this door opens, there's no turning back." That night, alone with the book, and Nam felt an odd energy from its words, not fear, but an invitation. Jesus' descent wasn't just history, it was a reminder that darkness always exists. And only by facing it could humanity find true light. Chapter 4, The Guardian Angels. The next morning, as sunlight slipped through the gaps in the curtains, and Nam awoke with an odd sensation. He'd dreamed of a tall, faceless figure standing in thick mist, its white wings stirring as if whispering something. The dream didn't frighten him, it left him strangely calm. When he told Lynn over breakfast in the hotel lobby, she chuckled. Maybe it was an angel. And Nam? He stopped eating, meeting her gaze seriously. "You're joking, but you might not be wrong." He pulled the Ethiopian book from his satchel, flipping to a page he'd earmarked. "Listen," he said, his voice warm yet firm. "It says here, and the Lord placed invisible watchers around mankind, nameless angels, to guide them through darkness they do not perceive. These aren't archangels like Michael or Gabriel we're familiar with. These are different, closer, quieter." Lynn leaned in, intrigued. "You mean real guardian angels, like they're right beside us?" And Nam nodded. "Yes. In the modern Bible, angels appear with blazing light, battling demons or delivering messages. But in the Ethiopian text, they have a different role, protecting us from dangers we don't even see. They don't intervene directly, they're guides in the shadows." He pointed to a smaller line, translating slowly. "When mankind strays, the angels leave signs, a breeze with no cause, a vivid dream, or a moment when their heart feels light." And Nam looked up, "Like my dream last night. Maybe it wasn't just chance." Lynn raised an eyebrow, half believing. "But if they're around, why don't we see them? Why no clear proof?" And Nam smiled. "Because that's not how they work. They don't need us to see them, they need us to feel them. The text says each person is assigned a guardian from birth, but we often miss their signs because our minds are too busy." She nodded, still skeptical. "So what are the signs? How do we know they're near?" And Nam sipped his coffee, thinking, "According to this, they're subtle, a sudden calm when you're afraid, a clear thought when you need to decide, even a stranger helping at the right moment, then vanishing. They leave no name, seek no recognition." Lynn fell quiet, searching her own memories. "Once," she said slowly, "when I was little, I nearly got hit by a bike at a village market. I was terrified, but an old woman pulled me back. When I turned to thank her, she was gone in the crowd. I always thought it was a coincidence." Her voice trailed off, her eyes widening, and Nam nodded. That might have been one of those moments. The text says angels sometimes take human form to intervene, but they never linger. Their task is to protect, not to stay. He turned to another page, recounting Jesus meeting these angels during his descent to hell. They stood at the boundary of light and dark. And Nam read, guarding lost souls from the devil's grasp. He blessed them, calling them the nameless faithful. He paused, looking at Lynn. They don't just protect us in life, they're gatekeepers between worlds. The story left Lynn pensive. She thought of times she'd felt watched, not with malice, but with gentle care. If you're right, she said, then the world's not as lonely as we think, is it? And Nam's eyes lit up. Exactly, but sadly, when these passages were cut, we lost that awareness of their presence. We started believing we face everything alone. As the morning passed, they kept talking, but in Nam's mind lingered on his dream. Was that angel a sign? Was he being guided on this uncertain path? When they left the lobby, a cool breeze swept through. Despite the clear sky, Lynn said nothing, but she glanced at Nam, and he knew she felt it too. On Jerusalem's busy streets, amid laughter and traffic, and Nam felt a sudden ease. Perhaps he wasn't alone in this journey. Perhaps, as the book said, guardian angels were near, quietly leading him through the mysteries he sought to unravel. Chapter 5. Errors in Biblical Translation. That afternoon, Nam and Lynn sat in a quiet corner of the ancient Jerusalem library, where sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful streaks on the stone floor. The Ethiopian book lay between them, open to a page Nam had marked with a scrap of paper. He adjusted his glasses, his voice low but passionate. Today, we're talking about the greatest mistake in Bible translation history. It didn't just change words, it changed how we see ourselves. Lynn leaned back, arms crossed, curious. The greatest mistake? What do you mean? Weren't the translations done carefully? And Nam gave a faint, bittersweet smile. Careful doesn't mean accurate. Listen, he pointed to a Ge'ez passage. Reading and translating, and the Lord took a portion of light from Adam, breathed life into it, and called it Eve, the bearer of a twin soul. Lynn blinked, surprised. Light? Not a rib? I thought God took Adam's rib to make Eve. And Nam nodded, his gaze intense. That's the problem. In the Ethiopian original, there's no word for rib. The term is salo, light, or essence. But when the Bible was translated into Hebrew, then Greek, and finally Latin, someone misunderstood or deliberately changed it to rib. Lynn frowned, piecing it together. But why? Doesn't rib sound more logical? It's physical, easy to picture, and Nam shook his head. That's exactly why. The translators wanted it simple, tangible, acceptable. Rib is bodily, but light is spiritual. It suggests Eve wasn't just part of Adam's body, but his soul, an equal entity. He paused, letting Lynn process. She tapped her fingers on the table, then asked, so how big a deal is this change? It's just one word, and Nam met her eyes, his voice deepening. Bigger than you think. When it became rib, it subtly placed Eve below Adam, something taken from him, dependent on him. But in the original, she's twin light, his soul's other half, equal and inseparable. This error shaped how we view gender, relationships, even humanity's nature. Lynn fell silent, as if struck by something profound. You mean, for thousands of years, we've believed a distorted version? And Nam nodded, yes, and it goes further. This change stripped away a bigger truth about creation. If Eve is light from Adam, humans aren't just molded clay, we're beings of divine light, linked to each other and God in a deeper way. He flipped to another page, showing a small note in red ink. The ancient Ethiopians believed this wasn't accidental. They wrote that early scholars altered it to avoid hard questions. If Eve is light, don't we all carry that light? And if so, why need anyone between us and God? Lynn sighed, leaning back. So they wanted to control the narrative. And Nam nodded, yes. Turning Eve into a rib made it a lesson about order, power. But the original was about unity and divinity in every person. She looked at the book, then at Nam. What will you do with this? Publishing it will spark a huge debate. And Nam smiled, resolute. I'm not afraid of debate. I just want the truth restored. It might shake some faiths, but it could also help people understand themselves better. As the sun faded, they left the library in silence. And Nam carried the book, his heart heavy yet hopeful. The translation error wasn't just linguistic, it was a crack in the grand picture of humanity and religion. Fixing that crack, he knew, would take more than words on a page. It would take the world listening. Chapter 6. Signs of the Times. It was late when Anam and Lin sat in his small hotel room. The dim light of an old lamp casting shadows on the cluttered stacks of books and papers. The Ethiopian tome lay open, but Anam didn't read aloud this time. He sat, hand on chin, his gaze distant as if peering through time. Lin broke the silence. You talked all day about angels, Eve, but what about this? She pointed to a Giez passage he'd marked with pencil. You said it's about Jesus' return. You mean, it's happening? And Nam exhaled, meeting her eyes. Not happening. Starting. He turned the page, his voice steady. It says here, when the final age comes, the sky will tremble, the earth will split, and men's hearts will brim with fear and hope. The Son of Man will return, not in blazing glory, but in stillness, a guide amid the storm. It's not what we're used to, no trumpets or shouting angels. Instead, there are subtle signs, clear if we look. Lin frowned. Signs? You mean disasters, wars? Those happen all the time. And Nam nodded. Yes, but not just that. The Ethiopian text lists specifics. Division among men will grow unmatched. Truth will be twisted, and false guides will lead the masses. Sound familiar? She thought. Then her eyes lit up. You mean, like now? Fake news, social media, divisive leaders? And Nam nodded firmly. Exactly. I'm not saying everything online is apocalyptic, but the way truth is warped, how people turn against each other, it matches the prophecy. And that's not all. He pointed to another line. It also says, children will dream what adults cannot fathom, and the lowly will bear good news. Yesterday, I read about a 10-year-old boy in South Africa who dreamed of a man in white leading him through a burning field. The man said, prepare. No one believed him, but it chilled me. Lin shivered, though the room wasn't cold. You think it's real? I mean, it could just be coincidence. And Nam cut in. Coincidence doesn't explain everything. Look around. Endless storms. Waking volcanoes. Ceaseless conflicts. Here in Jerusalem, last month, people heard strange noises from underground, like the earth groaning. Scientists called it a minor quake, but locals say it's a sign. She fell silent, gripping her water glass. So where are we in this timeline? And Nam took a deep breath. I don't know exactly, but this says before he returns, there'll be chaos, the age of darkness posing as light. I can't help thinking we're in it. What I've found isn't just history, it's a warning. Lin looked out the window at flickering streetlights. If you're right, what do we do? If he's coming? And Nam interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. We can't stop it, but we can prepare, not by hoarding food or hiding, but by living right, seeking truth, and helping others see it. He turned to the passage's end, a short line in bold ink. And when the hour comes, those who listen will see him. Not with eyes, but with hearts. He looked up. That's what I want with this book, to help people listen. Before it's too late. That night, alone, and Nam stared at the book, thinking of the prophecies and current events, wars in the Middle East. Cries echoing worldwide. He wasn't sure if this was the beginning or the end. But one thing was clear. The signs were here. No longer just words, but alive and breathing before him. Chapter 7. Spiritual Warfare. The rain had stopped as Anam and Lin sat in his small room on a late February evening. The space was still, save for the steady ticking of a wall clock. The Ethiopian book rested between them, but Anam didn't open it right away. He tapped a pen on the table, as if sorting the chaos in his mind. Lin spoke first. You said yesterday we're in a chaotic age. If so, what's next? If Jesus is returning, his enemy, the devil, won't just sit idle, right? And Nam nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. Right. That's why I want to end this journey with the book's final chapter, about spiritual warfare. He opened the book to its last pages, where the Giez script was bolder, as if the writer meant to underscore its weight. Listen, he said, his voice low but powerful. It says, when darkness rises, the Lord's words will be fire to burn it. Those holy verses, spoken with faith, will make demons tremble and flee. It's not just prophecy, it's a weapon. Lin leaned forward, intrigued. A weapon? You mean there are verses demons actually fear? And Nam nodded. Exactly. The Ethiopian text lists a few they believe are the strongest. Like this: "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" From Psalm chapter 27. But the original adds, "This word will dispel darkness. As the sun burns away fog." His voice grew firmer. Another: "I give you power to tread on serpents and all the enemy's might." From Luke chapter 10. But the Ethiopian expands, "When spoken, demons shrink, for they know that power cannot be broken." These aren't just prayers, they're declarations of war. Lin frowned. But why are they so powerful? Doesn't the devil know the Bible too? And Nam smiled meaningfully. Knowing and enduring are different. The text says the strength isn't in the words, but in the faith of the speaker. When a believer utters them with absolute trust, they become spiritual fire, something darkness can't withstand. He paused, looking at Lin. Have you ever felt a weight on you? An unseen fear, an unease you can't explain? Lin nodded slowly. Yes, especially lately, since we started digging into this book. And Nam nodded, unsurprised. That's not random. When we touch truth, darkness pushes back, but these verses are how we fight it. He scribbled a line on a scrap of paper and handed it to her. Try reading this aloud. "The blood of the Lamb has overcome you." O accuser. It's from Revelation, but the Ethiopian text says it's what Satan fears most. Lin took the paper, reading loudly, her voice shaky at first but steadying. When she finished, an odd sensation filled the room, like the air lightened, grew clearer. She looked at Nam, amazed. "I feel different, like something lifted." And Nam nodded. That's what the book teaches. Spiritual warfare isn't a battle of angels and demons in the sky. It's in our hearts, every day. These verses are tools, not to attack, but to shield. He stood, walking to the window, gazing at Jerusalem's night sky. When I was young, my grandmother read Psalm chapter 91 every night. "You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day." She called it her shield. Now I know why. Those words don't just comfort, they empower. Lin joined him, standing beside him. "So what will you do with all this?" "Publish the book. Teach people these verses?" And Nam turned, his eyes blazing. "Yes, not to scare, but to empower. If the final age is near, we need to be ready, not just to wait, but to fight." That night, alone, and Nam sat with the book, reading each verse aloud, feeling their power resonate within. Outside, the world spun with chaos and fear. But in this moment, he knew he wasn't alone. The spiritual war might be fierce, but with those words, he, and anyone who listened, could stand firm.